Bom dia. I am very sad not to be with you in Porto Alegre, of course. One day, maybe I will be able to come back and see you all when we've got rid of coronavirus. So that might be about 8 years from now, but we'll see. We hope sooner. Now, can I share my screen with people? This would be a good thing to do.
Can you see the green button?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Okay, good. So let me do this, and then we're ready to go. Good. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be speaking to you. I want to focus on our sense of smell, and I want to try to connect that with philosophical debates about consciousness. Now, smell is often thought of as a neglected sense. It hasn't had as much attention in psychology and neuroscience as vision or touch or even audition. And we also know that it's not just in science, but in ordinary experience that we tend to give very little attention to our sense of smell. Now, a recent paper in Science by John McGann suggested that scientific interest is due to a myth perpetrated by Broca in the 19th century, that humans have a very bad sense of smell. And in fact, we now know from lots of research that humans have got a superb sense of smell. Sense of smell is fine. It actually is even better than that of some animals. And the puzzle then is that it can't be science's lack of interest in smell that leads most of us to neglect its role in everyday conscious experience. So if we do have such a good sense of smell, why does it seem to feature so little in our experience? Well, I'm going to look at very popular scientific views about this, which say it's because smell doesn't feature very much in conscious experience, that a lot of our sense of smell, a lot of olfaction is going on unconsciously. Now, I don't think that's right. But then we do need a special explanation, which philosophers and scientists have to give jointly, as to why, if it isn't so all the time unconscious, or much of the time unconscious, why do we not notice it? Why are we unaware of it? That needs a special explanation. Okay. So here's the key question for us. What is the role of olfaction in conscious experience? We can mean several things by that. We can say, how much presence does olfaction have in perceptual experience? Does it feature all the time? Are you having experiences of smell right now as well as sight and sound? What effect does olfaction have on cognition and emotion? This is very little thought about by philosophers, but increasingly a subject of attention in science. What influence does olfaction have on behavior? Can it actually drive some of our behavior and some of our choices? And again, neuroscience and psychology has been attending to that. And lastly, how aware are we of the information that olfaction provides? Okay, these are our key questions. Here are not the key questions, but they're the ones that philosophers have from time to time addressed. And they are, what are smells? Are they objects? Are they properties? And you can think of this as being analogous to the question, what are sounds? Which has received much more philosophical attention. Some of the same issues arise. Some people don't think that we should think of smells as objects or even properties of objects, but we should think instead of smell as a process. A recent book by Anne-Sophie Barwich, Smellosophy, looks at the biology and suggests that's how philosophers should think about smell. But we don't have to look very far to see philosophers being very disparaging about smell. Kant famously thought smell was of so little interest and it was so disagreeable. Why would one give any time and attention to it? And here's a nice quote from Condorcet. Of all the senses, it's the one that appears to contribute least to the cognitions of human beings. Smell cannot afford any idea of shape, extension, or anything outside of itself or the perceiver. The experience of smelling is about but itself. A smell does not have any existence outside it being smelled. It is a sensation, and a sensation can only be in a sentient thing. That's Thomas. Peter Strawson also says in his book Individuals, when he considers whether there could be a world of sound and whether there could be a world of things that are particulars other than material bodies, he says, well, I won't spend any time looking at smells because taste and smell are strikingly more trivial than the other senses. After all, the world, you don't see the world differently if you have a cold. Now, I'm going to question that. But it's been popular philosophers to go for this very limited attention to smell. Bill Lycan says, phenomenologically speaking, smell is just a modification of consciousness. It doesn't carry any other interesting, important information. Okay. Well, let's start with this idea that humans have got a very bad sense of smell. We're supposed to think that because we are supposed to compare ourselves to rats and to dogs and say, well, human beings, much, much more primitive, limited sense of smell. But is that true? When we actually look at the odor thresholds of different species, we see that for some particular range of odors, the mercaptans, various other things, we notice that humans have actually got lower thresholds. They're better at detecting, they're keener at detecting than other animals. And in fact, if you ever want to take a dog into a competition on smell, try fruits. Dogs are hopeless at discriminating fruit odors. Humans are much better. Not surprising, dogs aren't particularly interested in fruit or eating fruit, but it does show you that it's not a simple comparison between the ability of dogs to have across the board better olfaction than we do. It's not true. Here's also something that a leading neurobiologist, Stuart Firestein, said to me. If dogs are supposed to have such a great sense of smell, and they do, and they can smell things, a kilometer away, why is it that when they get near to each other, they have to put their noses in each other's backsides to smell? I mean, that's kind of funny if they're very good at smelling anyway. Just a thought to leave you with about animals and smell. But also, here's another lovely set of experiments. This is from Noam Sobol's lab in Tel Aviv. And Noam Sobol has done lots of experiments to show that all of the things that dogs can do, we can pretty much do too. So this was when he was at Berkeley, and he had his grad students following a chocolate trail on the ground. So they are blindfolded, but asked to sniff the grass and to see if they can get to the source of the chocolate. And of course, they can do that perfectly well. They are not as direct or as quick as dogs. If you see on the left-hand side, you see a dog trail tracking its prey, but the human slower, but still successful. So we do have a reasonably good sense of smell, even a directional sense of smell. Here's how good our sense of smell is. TCA is cork taint, trichloroanisole. It is what spoils a wine. When you pull a cork on a wine and you smell something like a damp cellar or wet cardboard, it can ruin the glass of wine you have. Now, human beings, some human beings in particular, this is my colleague Ophelia Deroy, can detect as little as 3 parts per trillion of TCA in a volume of liquid. That means that you could take 3 Olympic swimming pools and put 1 drop into one of the pools, and Ophelia could tell 1 molecule, and Ophelia could tell by her nose alone which pool had the TCA. This is remarkable sensitivity. So we do have an acute sense of smell as well. Now we can measure people's sense of smell. We can measure people's sense of smell by this thing called the TDI score. Now the TDI score is where we measure with sniffing sticks people's threshold, how high or low does the intensity of the odor have to be before they detect it, can they discriminate one odor from another, and then free smelling, can they tell you that's the smell of cherry or pineapple or leather. And then we compute those scores and we can put people on a ranking. So we have an objective way of assessing people's olfactory abilities. But here's the funny thing. People are not very good at assessing their own olfactory abilities. There seems to be a mismatch between smell and meta-cognition. That is, people who say, I'm not very good, my sense of smell is very poor, when we take them into the lab and we measure their sense of smell, they sometimes have a very high TDI score. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who will tell you, I'm very sensitive to smell. Oh, I don't like the smell of certain stores. I'm very sensitive to odors in my home and so on. But often when we test them, although they have high confidence in their ability to smell, their score is low. So there's a funny way in which our metacognitive insight into our own ability is not good. There's a mismatch between accuracy and awareness of our olfactory abilities. But we can have metacognitive feelings that give us clues about whether or not we're smelling something. So when I'm smelling a cork from a corked wine, so I'm in a restaurant, the waiter pulls out the cork, gives me the cork to smell, I might think, I wonder if that's corked. I've since learned that if I even ask my question, then it is corked. If usually I'm happy and I don't pay any attention, everything is fine. But this is a metacognitive awareness, a little flag that goes up that says something is not right, or I'm having to ask the question. So feelings of not knowing or being unsure, and they maybe are indicators that you're nevertheless smelling something maybe just below threshold. Okay, so let's try to explain why we don't know that we have a good sense of smell and wonder why it is we're not sure. Well, one reason is we think we only smell when we sniff. But that's not true. As J.J. Gibson said, we smell because we breathe. We are continually taking in a raft of molecules from the environment, and smell is going on all the time. It's not only when we bend down and sniff a flower or wine or a dish. That's not the only time that we're actually smelling something. Now, there are two sorts of attention we could have. We could have top-down attention, directed attention, when we're trying to smell things. We have since learned that some people are very good at smelling disease on people's bodies. They can smell odors that are created by inflammatory responses in people, and that maybe we can detect by smelling. Super smellers can detect whether someone has got something wrong. This is when you direct your attention, you're really trying hard to smell. The other is bottom-up attention, attention capture, when an absolutely delicious smell just captivates you. You weren't thinking about it. I maybe visit Sophia and Adriano and I say, wow, that smells great, the churrascaria. What are we going to eat? I can smell this lovely roasted meat. So here, without trying, my attention is captured by smell. So these are two different directions of attention. Now, a lot of scientists are attracted to this minimalist view of olfactory attention. They say human olfactory attention capture is minimal and human olfactory awareness is minimal because much of human olfaction is unconscious. It's simply unconscious. Now, that's interesting. Does olfaction get switched off in the gaps between smelling? It is true, I suppose, that we don't maintain a permanent olfactory scene the way you maintain a permanent visual scene. So you're always, when you're awake and your eyes are open, you're always aware of the scene around you, and the brain puts a lot of effort and a lot of resources into maintaining that permanent visual scene. It can change as you move or as things move around you. And there doesn't seem to be the same sense of having that continued scene in olfaction. After all, adaptation happens when we're smelling the same thing for a good deal of time we stop paying any attention to it. It just simply seems to disappear from mind. Here's an example of that. I mean, one of the interesting things is the smell of your own home. So you don't really smell your own home anymore. When you go in day after day, you're not aware of the smell of your home, but everybody else's home has got a smell. You walk into any friend's house, relative's house, you think, yes, there's the odor. So why don't you smell yours? One view would be that because no information has been gained by having the same information kept alive, you simply switch it off. Now, I'm going to question that view because of what happens to people with anosmia, which I'll explain later, the lack of smell or the loss of smell. And I'm going to suggest that smell is involved in eating foods and tasting our food, and we don't have that same adaptation. Even though you put mouthful after mouthful of the same food in your mouth, you don't stop having any experience of it, even though it's the same. So I'm going to look at that in a moment. Okay, now, even if we have olfaction going on all the time without conscious awareness, it doesn't mean that our olfaction or odors are not evoking emotions and influencing behavior. We know they can still have an influence on behavior even when we're not consciously aware of them. So here are just a few examples. Recognizing your own kin. You can, if people provide you with t-shirts that are worn by a number of people, you can recognize which ones are your relatives. Mate selection. We have ways of being attracted to people because of their smell. I'll talk about that in a moment. Also, odor has a role in emotional recognition, recognizing other people's emotion, and even emotional contagion. People getting to feel afraid and, as it were, catching the mood of another. And they play a role in memory, recall, and accuracy. I can say something about that too. Okay, so kin recognition. Mothers can smell the clothes of their baby from among thousands of other babies. They can tell that it's theirs. We can tell whether someone is a relative of ours from just smelling a t-shirt that's worn by somebody and worn by others. Kin selection is interesting. We are, by and large, attracted to people whose smell, whose body odor, indicates that their HLA, which is part of their immune system, human leukocyte antigens, are far away from us. So we're attracted to people whose genes are far away from us, thus improving the chance of better immunities for our offspring. If somebody smells too close to your gene pool, you tend not to be attracted. You say, he or she is lovely, very nice, extremely nice person, very attractive, but I just can't do anything. They don't smell right. They don't smell bad, they just don't smell right. So this is maybe we have love at first smell instead of love at first sight. Sometimes you might meet people, you think they're just wonderful and you don't know why, might be the smell. So this is chemical signaling that's going on unconsciously, perhaps. Here's a really interesting piece of chemical signaling, again coming out of Noam Sobol's lab. It turns out there are odors in women's tears that reduce men's libido. Who knew? So wonderful set of experiments where they have to be real emotional tears, where he had people who readily cry at sad films, and they would say which film and which scene in a film they find very sad. They would come into the lab, and if they cried, they would collect their tears. They'd give them with other liquids to the male participants, and it turns out that men's arousal level and cortisol level, and indeed the sexual arousal is lowered when smelling women's tears. Very sexist result. They're still trying to find out whether it works in reverse, but in Israel it's quite difficult to get men to come in and cry into jars in the lab, they say. We also know the brain is very able to and interested in distinguishing between complex odors and simple odors. When you have people do a random task but while they're lying in the scanner, you get them to smell odors that pass. They're not asked to pay attention to them. We nevertheless later get the same participants to smell these odors and describe them. And the odors that are thought of as complex are the ones where they use descriptions or they tick off more descriptions they're offered. And it turns out that you can see a signature in the brain, in the anterior cingulate cortex, showing you that the brain is paying attention to this difference in odor. So there's a lot of unconscious stuff going on and a lot of effect on emotion and behavior. Nevertheless, we do use our sense of smell. We smell wine, we smell milk from the fridge or food to see whether it's gone off. We make perfumes. We like the smell of laundry and babies and so on. Now, if olfaction is at work without much conscious awareness, we need an account of that. And Noam Sobel and one of his colleagues suggest this. It's due to a form of olfactory change blindness. So he says olfactory stimuli are less prone to attract attention, and therefore humans have poor awareness of their olfactory environment. So this is where change blindness is, of course, can be demonstrated in vision, where you can show that if you're looking at a scene, then you have a blink, intentional blink, and then you show them the scene with a change. They're often not able to tell you what has changed in the scene. And Sobel thinks that olfactory stimuli are so little able to attract our attention that we don't notice things have changed in our environment till things have gone very badly wrong. There's also a temporal discontinuity. So he says in sniffing, we sniff in and then there's a long gap when we sniff out, so we sniff in again. And this means it's difficult to compare the inputs and outputs here, two inputs. So he thinks, again, this leads to less noticing of changes in our olfactory landscape unless they're plastic, okay? Yet, in an fMRI study, I'll summarize this for you. People are asked to do an attended and an unattended task. The attended task, they're to pay attention to the odors they're presented with, and the other, they are presented with odors, but they have auditory information to attend to. Even when they're attending to the auditory information, not attending to the odors, the brain is still very responsive to even very subtle changes in odors. So we're able to know, the brain is able to monitor, register very subtle changes in the environment around us in terms of the olfactory landscape. So if that doesn't make it into consciousness, maybe Sobel's right, but then why do we do the processing? And also there's a little bit of counter information in a way. This is from Ilona Croy and colleagues in Dresden. Changes in the olfactory environment are better detected than the presentation of the same odor again. If you keep presenting people with the same odor, they're not very good at knowing whether it's same or different, but if it's different, they're very good at noticing. So something about change and smell that is important and that I want to try to get at here. Let's go back to the fact that people don't usually have any awareness of the odors of their own home. If you've been away from your home for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and so on, you come back, you think, oh, that's how my home smells. But when you're there, normally, you often don't notice and are not aware of smells. So does that mean you just switch off olfaction? No. Because remember, you are particularly sensitive to any changes in that environment. If you come in and you smell someone's perfume, you think somebody has been in here. If somebody has been smoking in your home, you think somebody's been smoking. I've left the garbage out, I can smell something rotten. So it means that you're monitoring or registering a baseline from which you notice when there is a change, when something dramatic has moved away from that baseline. So it's not that you're not sensitive to it, but that you're ready to notice even very small fluctuations from the norm. Another reason for thinking that smell is still there and having an impact, which will help more with our ideas about it featuring in consciousness. You might think, okay, the brain is paying attention to the smell of my apartment It's not coming to consciousness, but if anything changes, it does come to consciousness. That might be what you think. But people who lose their sense of smell suddenly, and of course at the moment with COVID-19, we are seeing a lot of people who report losing their sense of taste and smell. I've been doing some work on this with some clinicians. And it's a sudden loss of smell, and it doesn't have nasal blockage. It's not as though they feel they've got a cold. They just suddenly cannot smell things. Coffee doesn't taste of anything. Bleach that they might be using to clean doesn't smell of anything. Now, when people lose their sense of smell suddenly, they notice something is very different about the rest of their experience. So people who have had brain injury or post-viral infection, they will often say, I feel alienated from my own home. It doesn't feel like my home. Something's missing. They talk about feeling as though they're behind glass. Now remember Strawson's remark, if you took away your sense of smell, the world wouldn't be seen in a different way. That's not actually true. Because of the multi-sensory nature of experience and that all our senses are combining, working collaboratively to shape your experience of the everyday environment you're in, losing one of those dimensions makes people recognize their experience is quite different. And they're not even just reporting not being able to smell the environment. They say everything else feels different. So that's interesting. That's important. We need to come back to that. However, this has become the idea that we only pay attention when there's something different has become very popular. This is a wonderful psychologist, Ep Koster, who came up with the FIT theory of spontaneous conscious odor perception. And his view is, most of the time, our sense of smell is working unconsciously. It's when something is unexpected that we suddenly bring it to consciousness, that it captures our attention, that it gets a breakthrough into consciousness. Why does that happen? Well, because it might alert us to danger, toxic foods, it might alert us to smoke or fire or something in the environment, or even the smell of cooking from the kitchen, which might attract you. But it's when something is unexpected. So our sense of smell, the function of our sense of smell, according to Koster, is to detect change. That's its sole function. If nothing's changed, you don't need to be consciously aware of it. But if there's change, and it's unexpected change, react to it. Now, what's very interesting, Koster doesn't use talk of predictive coding, but this is a perfect model of olfactory perception and awareness of olfaction, which lends itself to predictive coding, because this idea that we only become consciously aware of a smell when it's unexpected means you have to expect things to smell a certain way from how they look, from your familiarity with them. So your expectations are generating predictions about how things will smell, and it's only when those predictions are violated by the sensory input that you would get an error prediction message, and that would be passed up through the hierarchy, and then you would react to it and have to change your prior expectations. And we know when we look at this little model of the brain, there are as many and indeed more pathways going back from the piriform cortex and the olfactory bulb going down towards the iridium as there are going up. So there's a lot of top-down information that is being sent from the cortical areas in the brain that deal the primary areas of the brain in the cortex dealing with smell back down to the sort of earliest sites of it. So it's as though we are priming ourselves all the time about what to smell. And then if we get conflicting information, we might have to do something about that. And of course, that's the predictive coding model. Instead of thinking that we pass information up and that perception is about feed forward information that gets chunked, ordered, reduced, and then perceived, rather we are generating top-down predictions about how things will be at the levels below, and indeed right down to the sensory input levels. And it's only when sensory input mismatches the generated expectations that our priors set that we will revise, and it's in that gap that where we try to get them back into a shape that we get precision weighting for exactly what we do perceive. So this is the Bayesian brain with uncertainty and predictive coding. We don't just perceive input, but through comparing our prior expectations, different temporal scales throughout the hierarchy, a cascade of information to the sensory intake to reach accommodation and precision weighting, and then we get the perception. Now, that would be all very well, but it only deals with one aspect of perception, and that is smelling things in the environment, or what's called orthonasal olfaction. And this is Paul Rosen, biologist and psychologist, who pointed out we have a dual system of olfaction. We don't just take odors in through the nose, odor molecules in through the nose. Those odor molecules can reach the very same receptors in the olfactory epithelium when they come from the mouth. And when they come from the mouth, that's when you're eating food, you're chewing, you're swallowing, and the swallowing pulses those odors up to the nose. And of course, most of what we can taste, or what we call taste, is in fact due to smell. So if you ask what your tongue provides you with, it provides you with salt, sweet, sour, bitter, savory. That's it. And yet you can taste cherries and strawberry and mango and pineapple. You don't have pineapple receptors on your tongue. That's all coming from smell. You can't compute or there's no arithmetic to get the taste of pineapple from the basic tastes on the tongue. It's not sweet plus what? Salt, sour, bitter? No, none of it. So it's all coming from smell. If you don't have a sense of smell, you don't detect fruit flavors. So a huge part of what we're tasting is due to smell. And some philosophers were onto this early. So Brillat-Savarin, the philosopher of food, said he said he was tempted to believe that smell and taste are in fact but a single sense, whose laboratory is in the mouth and whose chimney is the nose, rather like the chimney in Porto Alegre behind Nitamar there on his screen. So this is the idea that taste and smell are very combined. So the olfactory component, it tends to lose its separate identity when combined with sensations in the mouth. You don't recognize its smell. When you're tasting pineapple, cherry, or strawberry, or mango, you don't recognize that's coming from smell. When it's combined with sweet, it doesn't give you its identity in your categorization of your own experience. So orthonasal olfaction, breathing in from the outside world, that keeps its identity as smell, but we don't have, although we do have conscious awareness of what smell from the mouth to the nose is like, taste of pineapple, it's not recognized or categorized as smell. So that's a funny thing. It goes missing, not in terms of not appearing in consciousness, but not as being recognized in consciousness for what it is. Now, Paul Rosen talked about different evolutionary functions for orthonasal and retronasal olfaction associated with different types of pleasure. There's the pleasure of anticipation when you smell food cooking, and then the pleasure of reward when you're eating it and when you detect whether you're getting the same experience you were expecting from the anticipated smell. And of course, that again plays back a little bit into the predictive coding story. So our flavor experience, when we're actually tasting the flavors of foods or wines, it's an incredible multi-sensory experience. It involves taste, involves touch, involves smell. It's an amalgam of the senses working together. So let's just have a few interim take-home messages before I tell you my view of all this. So there's a difference between orthonasal and retronasal olfaction in terms of the routes by which they reach the olfactory epithelium at the bridge of the nose, and there's a different way in which they're categorized. One is recognized as smell, the other is not. So they have different modal signatures, but nevertheless, we consciously experience what retronasal olfaction, when we're tasting and eating, gives us. And we don't lose our sensitivity to our sense of smell, even when smells are familiar, because as we saw with people who lose their sense of smell, their experience is very different. It's only, we don't know what we've got till it's gone when we are not recognizing how much smell is contributing to everyday experience. When you lose it and you feel your experience of your familiar surroundings is altered, not the same, something's gone, certain lack of pleasure, then you notice that it was contributing to experience. And this is brought out in a number of different ways. Quite often children are born without a sense of smell, congenitally anosmic. It's not recognized at first. After all, not much that's happening is giving you an idea. If they had trouble with their sight or hearing, it might show up more quickly, but often it's not noticed. Sometimes it's not until very young teenagers that they're diagnosed as having no sense of smell. And there's a Spanish philosopher called Marta Tafalla who writes very well about this. When she was a child, she said she saw people sticking their noses into flowers. She would do it too. She didn't know why they did it. It was very boring. She would hear people talking about wines and going on and on, writing poetry about how the wine was so wonderful and delicious. And then she would taste them and think they're very sour, they're not very interesting. I don't know why people do that. Now, when Marta at the age of 14 was diagnosed as having no olfactory bulb and not able to smell, she wanted to know what's missing, because up till then she thought, my perception of the world is complete. I'm perceiving the world with my senses, and now people are telling me there's this invisible thing that you don't, but which the rest of us are aware of and makes a difference to our experience. And she thought, what can they be talking about? And she's been trying a lot of her professional life to find out what's missing. And instead of trying to have descriptions of smell, which are no good for her, she's very aware of what does smell contribute to the rest of your experience, which would be missing for me. And in a very beautiful article, she describes the idea that there may be a difference between somebody like Marta without a sense of smell being in a garden and people like us with a normal sense of smell in that garden. Because she said, I might appreciate the geometry, the color, the arrangement, and the shape. But she said, I think people with a sense of smell, smelling the scent of the flowers, they feel more immersed in the space. They feel present. They feel very aware of being in that surrounding, in a way that I don't. Now, if you link that back to the way people describe their experience, even of their own home, when they lose the sense of smell, you realize she's right. Smell is contributing something to the character of our experience, either because it's wholly unconscious, but nevertheless having an effect on our experience, or because, as I want to say, I think we can think of olfaction as constant part of our conscious experience, modulating attention, awareness, and consolidating memories of place. Because quite often our ability to recognize the place we're in and find them familiar is because of how they smell. The smell of your office, the smell of your favorite restaurant, the smell of a gallery you like. When you walk in, you're able to think, yeah, I know this place. I feel happy and familiar here. When you lose your sense of smell, some of that familiarity is gone. So it may be that we're using smell as other animals do to lay down episodic memories about our surroundings and our places. And of course, elderly people lose the sense of smell. By the age of 70, a quarter of the population will have lost the sense of smell entirely. But they will also have problems with memory and episodic memory. So there may be a connection here about the role that smell is playing in retaining and creating new memories of place. So I want to say, rather than the minimalist view, it's not that smell only occasionally appears in consciousness. We don't notice it because it's always there. In other words, smell is the background to consciousness, modulated by the moment experience. That's all. Obrigado.
Thank you very much, Barry. Thank you for being here it's always a pleasure to hear you and to know more about our senses. And I will open for questions now. We have time. Who wrote here?
Julio.
Let me see.
I want to book a course. Yes. How are you?
Sorry, Julio. Okay, I will let you ask, but Julio, we have some other questions here on the chat.
Then go ahead.
Marco Silva wrote here some questions.
I can read the questions if you want me to.
Okay, that would be nice, Barry. Please.
He says, about smell and mating, does that also happen in, does it happen in cisgender heterosexual mating human behavior? Are the studies considering variability in mating behavior in humans? That's a very good question. I don't know, but I'm very happy to take that question back to the neurobiologists who've been investigating that. I think we should like to know. He also says, I mentioned J.J. Gibson. Do you think that his ecological theory of perception fares well with his new research? Yes, I do. I mean, I'm much more attracted to Gibson than many others are. And I like the idea that our senses are there to put us in touch with and give us understanding and ability to adapt and work well in our environment. So it would be a very funny idea if sound and sight and touch were all helping us to understand our environment out there, but smell and taste, just amuse yourself, just have some internal subjective experience that means nothing at all. I mean, why would we do that? So I do think they are about exploring features and dimensions of our environment just as the other senses are, and they work together. There's Marcos Silva.
Yeah, Marcos Silva. I don't know if Marcos wants to make the question. No, he's not there.
I can read it.
Okay.
Thank you, Barry. I'll read my question here. Thank you for your talk.
Pleasure.
That's a question on epistemology, in a sense, more broader sense. Some authors have already pointed out how regular epistemological vocabulary is built on visual metaphors, intuition, insight, judgment, or knowledge. Information should be clear, evident, sometimes obscure, etc. In a sense, this is what the whole tradition used to expect from knowledge. It should be complete, direct, in detail, panoramic. Alva Noe, for example, defends that vision is more like touching, incomplete, active, and using sensory-motor coordination. So that's a more speculative thing. So I would like to hear about you. How would be our epistemological concept if we use more olfactory and not visual ones?
Yes, well, I think it's
holistic, more emotional, more subtle, speculative.
More subtle, I think. I mean, it is interesting that we tend to think of visual metaphors, probably because our experience is so dominated by vision, and that's what comes to mind. But remember, lots of metaphors in thought are not visual. We talk about grasping a thought. We talk about something being hard to understand and so on. These are tactile. And quite often, even though we think vision is one of the best senses for epistemological security with the world, people often like to touch things to be sure. They say, yeah, I saw it, but let me touch it just, to believe it. So, doubting Thomas puts his fingers into the wound of Christ. It wasn't enough to see, he had to touch it, to say, can I believe my eyes? Also, we talk about sniffing things out. I don't know if you do that in Portuguese, but we talk about sniffing things out, or I've got a good nose for this. And I do think our sensory, we use lots of sensory cues to talk about things. Also, we use some sensory vocabulary to cross over to something else. certainly in English, if you're tasting a lemon, you say, oh, it tastes sharp. Now, sharp is a feel, but that seems okay to use touch as a way of getting at that sensation. So we talk about smells as being high and low. Mint is a very high smell. Musk or leather is a very low smell in terms of where you are. And that's to do with how light or heavy the molecules are, how fast they are. So I think a lot of the metaphors are rooted in facts about physiology to know whether something is... here's a funny thing. If you ask across the world, you ask people, if you had to put lemons on a scale between fast and slow, where are lemons? And they say fast. Banana, slow. Why? What's going on here? Why do we think lemons are fast, bananas are slow? Well, lemons, the acidity in lemons, our sour receptors fire faster and quicker, and our sweet receptors are slow and they build up slowly. So that way of thinking might reveal something about physiology, and I think our metaphors do too. Thank you for the question.
So the next question is
Nita
from Nita Marsh.
Thanks,
okay.
Barry. Well, this is precisely trying to account for an olfactory theory, precisely of memory in terms of olfaction alone, because in your talk it was very clear that you are going after the thesis that olfaction is like the background to all the other sense, and especially when we think of combining it with flavor and taste. But in the other examples you gave, we can have this multisensory understanding of olfaction. How about a theory of olfactive memory, the memory of olfaction alone, as we think of dogs and animals, just as you gave these different examples?
So olfactory is really interesting. Most of us will remember the story of Proust and the Madeleine. So Proust, in the novel, he dips his Madeleine into the tea and he tastes it and he thinks, what was that? And he does it again. Same experience. He does it 3 times, it's less. Very good psychologist, Proust. And he thinks, why am I having this sudden exciting experience? Then he realizes it's a memory, and then he realizes it takes him back to when his Aunt Leonie used to give him as a boy this little cake with tea. And we know now that olfaction can have this ability to transport us back to a previous experience very quickly. So the olfactory bulb is connected by 2 regions to the amygdala, which is a sense of arousal, but also of early memory, pleasure of early memory. So when you have a pleasurable experience, you can sometimes taste something or smell something, and you say, that takes me back to my grandmother's kitchen, or that reminds me of a friend that I knew a long time ago. So these are ways in which olfaction encodes very early memories, usually emotional memories, and when you experience them again, you didn't know you had that memory. You didn't know. You suddenly are surprised. Wow, now I remember. And it feels so vivid. And you don't remember smelling. You remember the scene, your grandmother's kitchen, what it looked like when you were there, what was going on around you. So it becomes a trigger for the rest of memory. And if you ask in evolutionary terms, why should that be? I think this is a just so story, but I like it. If an animal detected a very good food source, thought this is fantastic food, it would try to remember how to find that source again. So it would listen to what was going on around it. It would look around it. It would have all of this multisensory information as cues bound to that very pleasurable experience based on taste or smell. So I think that's why we do it. So I think olfactory memory is very important, and it's usually episodic memory. It reminds us not of things in general, but particular people or places that we've been. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Thank you. Julio now has a question.
Yeah, it was a comment. I once took a course in wine tasting. At each class, we were explained very carefully what to taste. And at the end of the class, we were given a blind test. I was amazed by how different we were in our capacity to taste and smell specific elements. Can you comment?
Yes. Well, so we know that your sense of smell gets better when trained. So it's a bit like a muscle. Our eyesight won't improve. It will gradually deteriorate. Our hearing it can get more precise, but we can't hear things further. But you can train your sense of smell to get better, and you will lower your threshold. You'll be able to pick out things quicker at lower concentrations. So this is exactly what wine tasters do. The difficult thing for wine tasters is a wine is a very complex smell. It's got 1,000 different molecules. It's a smell that's not in nature. It had to be made by humans, right? And it's complicated. It's a huge mixture. It's really hard to be able to pick out the bits that are going on in there and say, this is Cabernet, this is Carmenere, this is Malbec, and so on. But you start to get a little bit of a stereotype for a Cabernet or a stereotype for a Malbec. And then once you've got that, you can probably say, well, it's a little like the stereotype, it's slightly different, but you use these as templates to help you explore. Also, we know that perfumers and wine tasters actually get thicker gray matter in the cortex after they've been trained. So you can actually make the brain do more smelling by recruiting more bits of the brain to do it.
Okay, now, thank you. The next question is from Filippo. Can Filippo?
Yeah, I can't switch the video on because it says it's not habilitated, but you can hear me, I guess, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to push a little bit to see what Barry you would respond to a skeptic about your arguments. So I take it that you have two main arguments. One is we don't smell our own homes because that the alleged explanation is because we wouldn't get any new information, but at the same time we smell the same foods that we eat regularly, even if there is no new information to be gained there. And then the other argument is the Tafaya argument that says, well, sort of when you lose the sense of smell, you recognize there's something different. It's a bit of a Siegel sort of phenomenological contrast type of argument.
Yeah.
So I wonder what you would say in response to a skeptic who said that first, the food ingestion is a lot more evolutionarily salient, right? So there's a lot more danger involved in eating food, even if it's the same type of food, right? There's a lot more to be lost if, so that particular day your salad is off, and but the smell in your home, as long as it's not particularly intense or dangerous, then so that would explain why in those cases, in the food cases, we have much more consciousness of smell. And the response to the Tafaya argument would be something like, well, I mean, it's the same thing with hearing, right? So when you have a air conditioning in the office, and then at some point at 8 o'clock, and where I work at 8 o'clock it stops. So I suddenly realize, oh, there was the air conditioning. How much more fearful it is now. I sort of a skeptic, I'm not sure what my view would be, but a skeptic would say something like, well, you know, every now and again you have some awareness. It's not like you're either never conscious or you're conscious all the time. There's an in-between position that says, well, every now and again you breathe, maybe, you know, and you smell the thing. So of course, when you lose the smell, the sense of smell completely, then you'll feel something different, right? Because your baseline thing is different.
So those are really good questions, and I want to take them in reverse order. So you're absolutely right that we don't have a conclusive argument from the phenomenal contrast cases, and your example of the air conditioning is good. But remember, there are two interpretations of what's happening with the air conditioning. One is you are conscious of it, but not attending to it. So, and then your attention is suddenly called to it. So it's very difficult, experimentally, it's very difficult to get at that difference. So if I say to you now, right now, to everyone, I want you to concentrate on the sensations in your left foot. Okay, can you do that? Now you're very aware of your left foot. So the question was, have you made those sensations happen? Or were they there but not attended to? Experimentally, very hard to get at, although it does seem as though conceptually it's easy to see there are two possibilities here. So I agree it's not definitive. The thing about, but it goes slightly differently to the, I mean, even in the air conditioning case, why is it that you say, ah, that's better? You know now that something was contributing to your whole experience that wasn't as good as this. So, you know, you are doing a comparison of how agreeable your experience was before and after the sort of 8 o'clock cutoff point. So that suggests something was contributing to your experience before. The other thing is, on the food, I wasn't so convinced by your example because why don't we have the same mechanism, which is I'm eating, I'm unconscious, but of course, if there's something toxic, I should become conscious. That's the Sobel view and the Ep Koster view, is if something is unexpected, you will switch on and you will pay attention. Just as if you go into your home, you say, oh, somebody's been smoking here. You're immediately kind of aware of it. But why would you need to be aware of every mouthful of everything that was, and especially since, you know, as long as we live in quite good environments and we don't get poisoned that often, lots of the food that we eat regularly, again and again, the breakfast cereal, is the same. Why? We've got far more experience of it being the same than we have of anything changing. Why would we keep it there? And remember, it's the same molecules going to the same receptors in the nose, either via the mouth or outside. So why would it be unconscious of the ones outside, but be conscious of them when they're in the mouth? Now, you may say because it's more serious, because it's internal and so on. But it's a very funny idea that receptors and molecules could actually do that conscious switching. Why? What would be set up in the brain to do that?
So Barry, we have.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so we have many other questions, but we have just time for more 2 questions. And the question from Sergio, I will read because to shorten the time. And then we have a question from Walter. Sergio asks, thank you very much for your talk. I have a question regarding the representational content of olfactory states. Do you think that olfactory states have content? And if so, how do you think that we can develop an account of the content of olfactory states? Thank you.
That's a really good question. I do think they have content, and we now have to figure out what theory of content we want. People often say when they're dealing with smells, oh, you can't say anything about smells, you know, they're very difficult to describe, we don't have the vocabulary. And that's a language point. But if you ask experientially, smells give us quite a lot of information. One, is it familiar? Have I smelled this before? Two, is it pleasant or unpleasant? Most smells are not neutral, they're one or the other. Three, how intense is the smell? So you've got what is the particular quality that makes it that kind of smell? How intense is it? And what are its hedonics? Is it pleasurable or not pleasurable? And is it familiar? You also have information from a smell. Am I smelling something edible or inedible? Is this the smell of a flower or of a herb? I mean, you've got lots of content of experience with olfactory episodes, and I do think we have to figure out what kind of story we have. Philosophers often just think they're trying to figure out how we can have content about objects, and smells might not be the right kind of thing to be object representations of objects. Claire Batty is good on this. She writes about us you say there is coffee smell somewhere, but you don't know where it's located, and you don't know there's coffee around here, but you don't know where it's located, and it's a sort of existential content claim, but she doesn't think it's an object claim as such. And I think there's something right about that. But I want to encourage everyone who's interested in representational theory of perceptual content or experiential content to think about olfaction, because it's rich and it needs work done there.
Thank you, Barry.
Pleasure.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, that's you.
So the last question would be from Walter Canielli.
Thank you, Barry. Of your work on computer ontology, but I did not know of your interest in smell philosophy, so very nice. And by the way, if you don't mind, I will write to you privately on some questions about computer ontology. But this
I would love to hear from you, but I think you may be confusing me with the other Barry Smith.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm not going to talk about them right away.
But there are two Barry.
I will write you an email message about that. But on our side, talking about olfactory memory, my question is the following. Well, we know that computer memory, so is usually discrete, is quantitative, so you can measure it, you can store it, you can reproduce it, etc. So it seems to me that an olfactory memory would have a kind of an inherent qualitative character. They are very hard, it seems to me, very hard to be reproducible or stored or use it again and again. So then it will, if this is true, they will have a completely different nature from computer memory or digital memory. I'd like to hear your opinion.
I think this is super interesting because we are very convinced at the moment that we'll be able to store lots of our history digitally, because we think, we will have video information, we'll have auditory information, we'll have text and so on. And we tend to think we'll record our whole history, but we will leave out those things like taste and smell, other sensory experiences that we can't capture. We can capture the molecular information. We've got gas chromatography and mass spectrometry will tell you exactly what was in the source of the odor, but it won't tell us how we perceive it. It won't get the qualitative part which features in memory. People are trying to make artificial noses, and you can see why, because they want them to be able to detect explosive substances at a distance and to detect toxic chemicals without endangering humans. But they can tell you what the material is. They can't tell you how it's experienced. So I think I'm very interested in this. I'm always telling people who work on the human brain and on digitization, don't forget the other senses. They have to be part of the experience we have. So thank you for reminding us of that. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Barry. I hope It's a joy to see you and hear you and have your participation in our meeting. I hope that not very long from today we can see you in body and smell.
I would like that very much, and I'd like to thank you. It's a lot of work to make this happen, but although we are physically distanced, we're not socially distanced, and you've helped to bring philosophers together, and I would like to thank you for that, and I hope to be there and see you all in Brazil whenever I can. So, muito obrigado.